Okay, welcome everybody. Great to have you. Welcome to I'm Calling You Out. And this session today is really about a couple of things. It's really about for sales leadership to really know how to evaluate and assess calls, really for salespeople as well. And it's really challenging you to step outside your comfort zone and think about different approaches you can take when you're on the calls. And really a focus on a technique called humble inquiry, which is a very powerful way to ask questions to people and extract information from them in an authentic and honest way. So I want to start out by thanking many of you have reached out to me from past webinars about doing some private sales coaching. We've had a lot of requests for virtual leadership and sales training for companies. So thank you, all of you, for those inquiries, and I appreciate those opportunities, and we'll be looking forward to working with many of you. So I want to just give you a quick background about myself. We're going to go through this pretty quickly because I really want to get to the topic at hand. But, you know, I think the thing I always like to share with people is that what I love doing about these webinars and training and coaching is I love helping people become more confident and effective at communication. Communication is such a broad term, and a lot of people struggle with the many core competencies that go with communication. But to me, what I always try to focus on is there are three ingredients whenever I do any training and coaching. One is emotional intelligence, one is communication intelligence, and one is multi-generational intelligence. So every time I do a training, there are aspects of each of those kinds of intelligence within the training. And there's a core value that I have, which is continuous and never-ending improvement. And when you all take time out of your day to trust me enough that I can add value and ideas and thoughts and awarenesses to what you're doing, I take that responsibility pretty seriously. And so up on the screen, these are some of my goals that standards I have for myself that I'd like to achieve with you today. Certainly would like to stimulate some thought, but ultimately I'd like you to be able to get off the webinar today with the confidence and comfort to know that some of the things we're talking about, you can apply those instantly into your personal and professional lives and increase your earning power for sure. One quick request I have, and I say this at the beginning of every webinar, you know, it's very hard to multitask. And when you're doing so much screen time these days with clients, prospects, peers, people at your company, it's so easy to get distracted. So please shut off your phone, shut off your email, remove any potential distraction you may have. And you know yourself well enough what's going to distract you from concentrating today, but please remove all those distractions. I think you'll be happy you did. Okay, so I would like everybody to type in for a moment. I have a very important question, okay? And I want you to think for a moment about when you're on the phone, when you're interacting with people, what is your biggest challenge? Think about if I could solve a problem for you when you're having phone interactions with people. Find a magic wand so that I could solve any problem for you today. Can you type in very briefly what those problems would be? Because I will certainly try to incorporate as many of those situations into the webinar today, and whatever ones I don't, I could deal with offline. But let me know, what are some of the challenges you're all feeling like you're having when you're talking on the phone or having effective phone calls? Securing a meeting face-to-face, yep, that's a great one. Really, and when it comes to securing a meeting, it's really just securing a meeting, period, but face-to-face is ideal. Talking too long, rambling, keeping focus, that's a good one. Getting someone to open up, retaining time allotment. Tom, can you be more specific when you say retaining time allotment? Transitioning from casual to business. Yes, we're going to cover that today, getting to the decision makers. Okay, keep them coming because the more of them I see and the more I will transition, but these are all great ones so far. So let me get into the agenda today, which feeds off the ideas you all just had. One of them is we're going to talk about a call outline. And when I say a call outline, it's really going to talk about the questions you have to ask. These are non-negotiable questions. And frankly, when I say you have to ask, it's your job to find a way to interweave these questions into the conversation. We all agree we don't want to be scripted. We don't want to sound like we're coming through a template. But at the same time, it's important that these are questions you really have to have the answers to at the end of an interaction. The second is the ability to self-assess the success of a call. You know, I have to tell you all a quick anecdote it's interesting is when you, in your career, think of times when you've gone on a job interview, right? And then you finish the job interview and then you talk to someone in your life you trust and they say to you, how did the job interview go? And what do we say? We say, good, I guess, because what do we really have to go on? Unless the employer laid out a clear next step of you're hired or we have another automatic appointment or you're going to interview with others, you don't really know. And so a lot of people, when they come out of a job interview, they're depending on body language, feedback, responses to understand, which is fine, but you're not always going to get that. So when you get on a sales call, I think part of the problem is when you get off the call, if you don't get that instant gratification of what you wanted on the call, which a lot of you are typing in the chat box, then you don't know if it was good or not. And that's one of the things I want you to take away from this webinar today. You've got to be able to evaluate not only your performance on a Zoom or in-person or sales call, but you've got to understand patterns and trends of your approach that are working and not working to become better. The third thing is earn the right to sell by asking agenda-driven questions. This is an enormous part of our Mindset Go philosophy, and I will cover that as we get into the webinar today. Qualifying people so you don't get strung along, and certainly dealing with curveball questions. We will get to all of those things today. Okay. So, look, before we get into how to be effective in an interaction, let's talk about the challenges in actually starting the interaction. Now more than ever, I'm seeing it and I'm hearing it. People who are saying they're not inclined to pick up the phone. And did a webinar a couple of weeks ago called Proceed with Caution, where we talked about, you know, the fear of talking to people and knowing if what their priorities are these days. You know, we're hearing a lot of news about businesses reopening and such. But this is, I want you to keep it really simple. You've had enough people in your career, I'm sure, tell you how important preparation is on a sales call. So I'm not even going to waste any time on that today. What I want to talk about is preparation's one thing, but confidence that you really understand what your goals are, what you want to do, and what you want to say is something else. And there's 3 goals I want you to have when you pick up the phone. One of them is you've got to sound different. And what I mean by that is when you start a call and you start an interaction with someone, you can just assume that that prospect has baggage and past experiences with someone, that the second they begin an interaction with the salesperson, they already have preconceived notions of what's going to happen. How will you sound different? How will you not fulfill their worst fears of what you may be like? The second thing is sound curious. Go in with the mindset of curiosity that you're really trying to discover what's going on. That is huge. And the third is make it about their needs and not about yours. And I know you've probably heard that 100 times too, but that's where sales emotional intelligence comes in, because it's easier said than done. You can go into a call saying it's going to be about their needs, not yours. But then once you get rolling and in the call, you may forget that. Preparation and competence. Do you have the competence to know how to be effective on a call? Now, one of my favorite things to talk about when I do training and coaching is what I was just alluding to, which is what's going through the other person's head. And I'm not talking about necessarily a cold call. It could be a warm call. It could be a referral. It could be any kind of interaction like this. But what's going through their head when they begin the conversation? Now, we know in life, the hardest thing to accomplish is to build trust with people, right? There's nothing more important than trust. So in the beginning of an interaction, how do you sound different? How do you build trust? How do you alleviate what people's fears are? Now, to me, one of the methods I use when I go into an interaction is I will start out an interaction. I'll say something along the lines of, hey, before we get started, let me just share with you a few of my core values. First of all, I won't waste your time. Your time, my time is too valuable, and I will really be mindful of that and make sure that as we go through this, it'll be very respectful of your time. 2, commitment. I want to make sure I educate you on what the best decision is and make you feel comfortable that making a commitment is a very difficult thing to do and a difficult step. So I want to make sure I address all your needs and any questions you have so you feel comfortable making that commitment. And third, I know that making this kind of decision of a purchase of a product or a service is a very big step, and you're putting your neck on the line. So I respect that. And I want to make sure, again, that you have all the details and the due diligence and information you need to feel comfortable making that decision. So basically, webinar participants, what I'm saying here is that I know fear of making the wrong decision, fear of commitment, fear of time being wasted. Those we know, those are 3 of people's biggest fears in an interaction. So if they're thinking it, most people are thinking it, I come right out and address it. And I found it's a really effective way to build trust. And again, I've said this before, it's got to be authentic. Those are core values for me. So it's not a line, it's not a manipulation. That's truly how I feel. So here are the things that prospects are typically worried about: commitment, time, money, making the wrong decision, fear of the unknown, fear of making past mistakes again. And I want to talk about the money aspect. And I'm just going to say, before I finish this topic, I'm just going to say, I recognize I've talked to so many people about what I'm about to say over the years, and I know there's very mixed feelings about this. So take what you will from this next point. Most of the time, all of you on this call are selling different products and services, okay? But we all are worried about money. When you get a proposal, if you at any time in your life have been on the receiving end of a proposal, we know the first thing people look at is the cost. Cost is a barrier that, whether it's the biggest barrier, a small barrier, a barrier, it's a barrier. So a lot of times people will start out an interaction with either wanting to know the cost, or they won't even focus and can't even process what you're saying because all they're thinking is, how much is this going to be? And this is really funny to me because a lot of times when you're on an interaction with someone and the person's very responsive to the different add-ons and upsells you're making, and they're like, oh yeah, that's interesting. But you know in the back of their head saying, oh, how much is this going to cost? And how much is this going to cost? So to me, one of the things I often say in the beginning of the conversation is, look, I know cost is important, as it should be, and I will definitely address those concerns. It would be hard for me to address cost until I understand more of your wants and needs, and once we go through that, I'm happy to share the cost. Because if you don't do that, they're going to be thinking it. So I strongly address cost in the beginning of the conversation. And if they bring up cost, all right, then you could say the same thing, but either way, don't run from it. Be honest about it. Tell them you'll address it so it's not an unknown. Okay. So elephant in the room. So one of the things I notice when people are having an effective interaction in sales is salespeople love to cling to logistical questions. Okay. I work with the diversity of industries I work with is pretty broad, but salespeople never forget to ask logistical questions because those are the questions they know they need to get the answers to make the sale and to send the proposal and to get all the details. Every time you start with a logistical question, what happens is you're just like everybody else. And there's no trust, there's no rapport building, there's no anything because you get right into the details. And you know what the elephant in the room is? The elephant in the room is time. When we're lucky enough to get an interaction in sales, we're so grateful we got someone on the phone or we got someone to respond to us that when they tell us they only have 15 minutes or 20 minutes, or actually, let's say they don't even tell us that, right? We're in a rush because we're so grateful. We want to maximize this opportunity and take advantage of every minute of that interaction, because who the hell knows when we're going to get in touch with them again, and who the hell knows when they're going to respond to us again. So the elephant in the room is time. It's this thing that we always tell ourselves we have to be mindful of time. And here's the problem. I'm going to give you two scenarios. And all I want you to do when I tell you these two such scenarios, if you like scenario number one, type in a 1. If you like scenario number 2, type in a 2. Here's the scenarios. Scenario number 1 is you trust yourself. You shelve all the logistical questions. The prospect has told you you have 20 minutes, and you just make it all about them. You use the 20 minutes to understand their deepest, darkest fears, needs, wants, dreams. And you're building trust. And the only thing they know in those 20 minutes is that you're going to do that. Scenario number 2 is you just say, hey, I only have 20 minutes. I got to get to the point. I've got to collect the data I need. Wait, don't say yet, because I've got to ask you one other part to this. You got to get the data you need. Who knows when you'll reach them again? I've got to ask the 20 minutes worth of questions. Okay? Now, this is what I'm asking. In either of those scenarios, I know you're probably inclined to say 1 because of the way I've led you. But what I'm asking you is, do you think your prospect would be more likely to continue the conversation with you based on using method 1 or 2? That's my question to the group. Interesting. So there's a mix. So here's my experience, folks, in doing this training for a lot of years. And this is my experience. Doesn't mean it's a right or wrong answer, but I'm going to tell you what I found. That when you use scenario 2, very often after that 20-minute window, you're going to need to talk to them again. You're going to have more questions. But the problem is, when you collect all the data you need to get them the proposal, and they've asked all the questions they need to do, they don't need to talk to you anymore because they've gotten what they've wanted. So you miss the opportunity to build rapport. So in scenario number 1, if they feel like you don't sound like every other salesperson, you're really invested in their needs and their wants and overcoming their fears and baggage, the likelihood at the end of the conversation is, if you said to them at the end of the 20 minutes, hey, I don't think we've covered everything, can we set up a different time to talk? They're more likely to continue that conversation because you're not really in a position to send them a proposal yet. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, look, one of the points I want to make here is so much of life in communication, not just sales, leadership, personal lives, relationship, sales, is situational awareness. But what I am asking you to take away, whether you're a 1, a 2, a bit of both, wherever you're sitting on this, I want you to ask yourself how often you let your own personal fears around time in the way, and how often you're rushing through things, not because you have to, because you feel like you need to. And I will tell you, I have had multiple, and I'm sure if you were all being honest about this, I have had multiple interactions in my career and life, and not just in sales, where I started out an interaction where someone said, okay, just so you know, I only have 15 minutes. And once I demonstrated the value and the caring and the need in the 15 minutes, they found more time. That happens a lot. So think about that, right? Think about when that's happened. So again, it's got to be, don't let your own fears around someone being in a rush. Listen, part of your job in any kind of presentation, again, it doesn't just have to be sales, in any kind of meetings or leadership, is being respectful and mindful of time, but not being fearful. And trust your own ability to engage and build rapport and build trust. So that's a very important takeaway. All right, so now we're going to get into the must-ask questions, okay? And the first 3 on the list, you all can read, so I'm not going to go over all of them with you. But what I can tell you is the first three on the list we're going to get into a little bit more specifically after this slide. But in the meantime, I want to make a couple of quick points as you're evaluating and reviewing these questions. Number 4 is a very important question to me because it's a different way of asking how they'll be happy. And a lot of times when I've asked that question, decision makers, key stakeholders, call it whatever you want, in a year, people will struggle to answer. They'll be like, geez, I don't know. That's an interesting question. I don't know. To my response is, well, let's think about it for a minute. Take a second. It's not a rush. You want that answer because whatever they give you for that answer is how you're going to be measured. That's the ROI. And frankly, if they don't have the answer, what you've just done is you've paved the way for them to ask the question to the stakeholders so you can get the answer. Either way, that's a win. Number 5, this is the last one I'll cover before we continue with this. Number 5, what experience do you have purchasing a service or product? It's a very important question because salespeople often go into an interaction ready to regurgitate certain pieces of information that contribute to the value proposition, differentiators, things like that. The problem is the buying process has very much changed. So you might be sharing information that they might already know. They might be deep enough in the process. They've already done a lot of due diligence and research. You want to understand where someone is in the buying product process for multiple reasons because they can tune you out and they'll stop listening if you tell them things they already know. Okay, so there's 3 kinds of questions. The first kind of questions are called probing questions. Now, if you're in sales, I don't care if you're in your first day of sales, you sure as heck know what a probing question is. It's really kind of outdated old terminology for trying to understand a prospect's pain points. So I'm not impressed when someone asks a probing question because you shouldn't even get in the door if you don't even know how to do that. But there's 2 other deeper level questions I want to cover. One is just a follow-up question, and one is a technique which I alluded to earlier called humble inquiry. And humble inquiry is really going to the next level when asking a question. So to me, you've got 3 levels of quality questions, and I'm going to actually illustrate in a very specific example what I mean. So let's look at root cause. How do you get to the root cause of someone's problem? And when I alluded to in the beginning of the presentation, as a leader or as a salesperson, when I'm evaluating my own cause, one of the things I'm listening for is, did I actually get to the root cause of why they would use my service or product? So simple question, why us, why now? Now I'm going to tell everybody, you must ask that question. You have to know the answer to that question. When people are willing to meet with you, think about this for a second. If they all of a sudden are willing to meet with you and they meet with you and you ask them what their pain point is, they just didn't realize this pain point happened yesterday. They've known about it for a while. If sales are down, then why did you wait until now to reach out to a trainer or coach? Like something had to happen to be reactive and trigger. And if you don't get that information, you're missing a critical detail because it's not just sales are down, it's something has happened that has provoked action. Okay? That's the why now. Why us? Yeah, why you? Most of us work in markets that are saturated. Hell, there are thousands of trainers and speakers and coaches like me out there. I know that. So if you took the time to come to my webinar, if you took the time to listen to me, why? What is it so great about us? What is it so great about me? And I'm not being facetious. I wouldn't say it like that. And I wouldn't necessarily phrase it in that exact term, although it's not bad. But you've got to know, why did they take the time when everybody is so protective of their time? And they are so more qualified and knowledgeable in the buying process. Why were they willing to meet with you, and why all of a sudden now is it a problem? So that's what I call the probing question level. The next level is, now I want to get to a follow-up question. They answer, sales are down. Well, so what do you think are the contributing factors to sales being down? Now, I want you to notice the wording in my question. Not what do you think is the contributing factor? What do you think are the contributing factors to make it even more open-ended to get them to stimulate thought and share more information? So what do you think are the contributing factors? So you can see what I wrote. They said, in this scenario, they said, well, not enough training, poor closers, marketing and sales not aligned, poor leadership. Yeah, it could be a whole lot of those things, right? So my question to you all is, what's your next question? Because this is where the humble inquiry comes in. This is where the people in sales who are the highest level listeners are thinking big, big picture. Where do you go with that last answer? How do you think you can change that? Interesting. Good. Can you help me understanding more detail? So there are so many different, as a matter of fact, there is, by the way, Michelle, your answer I absolutely love. What do you think is needed? And I don't want to glaze over that, because we are often, whether this person is the decision maker, the sole decision maker, not the decision maker, whatever it is, you want to value them, right? So when you ask them, what do you think is needed? It makes it seem like you care about their opinion as much as you care about the overall solution. I think that's huge. Michael says, if you had to pick one issue, what is it? That's a solid approach. Here are two of the things, and there's a lot of different answers, but here are the two things that I think are really important to ask in this situation. And all the answers so far have been good and would be valuable. And by the way, well, I'll skip that. So number one, first answer, what are the consequences if the situation doesn't change? That's huge. Because in that moment, when they're telling you the deeper level problem, why they see it's the problem, so what? Think in your head in that point, you guys. Think in your head, so what? Okay, so your sales are down. So what? Sales have been down for the last month, 3 months, 6 months. So what? What's the real consequence? You must get your prospects to articulate what the true consequence is to this problem. Because I have to tell you, when you think of when you've had deals be strung along, and when you think of people who have expressed a pain center, and then it stops and it stalls, it's because they themselves hadn't articulated the consequences. A lot of people act in certain behaviors because they think they're supposed to. They're following a societal or a professional organizational template. And so that's why they take action or do due diligence, right? So consequences are critical for them to be able to articulate. And just like I said before, if they can't answer it, they'll go to the other decision makers and get that answer for you, which is like gold. Second thing is, in a different spin on that is, how would solving this problem impact your team? So it's really the reverse. It's a positive spin on the question I just asked. We come in, I'm the best sales training company you've ever had. Everybody loves it. So what? What's the impact it'll have on the team? You need for them to understand the consequence, and you need them to understand the impact. Now, there's a handful of other questions you could ask. Many of you have typed them in the box. There's good. What's your existing plan to tackle the problem? What have you tried previously? What worked and what didn't work? Who in your company is involved in fixing this problem right now? By the way, a great lead-in to find out about decision makers and who else will be involved in the process. Yes, how much is this issue costing per year? Or just in general, how much is this issue costing you? It's similar to the consequence. So look, probing questions are basic. Follow-up questions are should be basic, but getting to that third and fourth and fifth level question, and here's the problem, everybody, I'm going to say it again, elephant in the room. Can you imagine you've been told you have 20 minutes? You ask this question, why us, why now? And they're following right along with your lead. You're asking all kinds of follow-up questions and humble inquiry, and you're doing it. And all of a sudden you look up, you're 15 minutes into the call, and that one starting question, why us, why now, took all this time. Was that wrong? Like, I'm not following. That's not wrong. If they're sharing information with you and they're opening up with you, they're comfortable with you. They're starting to trust you. So if you don't go to the deep level questions, you lose because you're missing opportunities. When someone wants to talk, let them keep talking. People like to talk. Let them keep talking. Okay. So for those of you who attended my Proceed with Caution webinar, you know we talked about this concept, happy years, and we're not going to spend much time on it, but I just want to remind people as a reinforcement for what we just discussed. Happy years, you all know what big eyes are. Big eyes in the supermarket when you haven't eaten for 4 hours and you go shopping, it's never a good idea. Happy years are this expression, when it's too good to be true, it is. And so in that humble inquiry follow-up question process we just talked about, if you get an initial answer to that pain center question and like, oh, I know why I'm going to get this deal because sales are down, that's happy years. Asking a question, anticipating an answer, and getting the kind of answer you want. If you stop asking follow-up questions, it's settling and you got happy years and you missed opportunities. All right. So now I want to talk about segues and transitions. Okay, so one of the biggest challenges in an effective sales call or interaction, I feel like, is to bring up money and budget, right? So we're going to talk about a couple of things quickly about segues and transitions. The first one is, I want you to notice the difference between how I phrased these two questions, okay? So I would like to know, during an interaction, what stage of the buying process are you at, and are you evaluating other options? I want to know, if they're looking at 3 competitors, am I the first in line, am I the second in line, or am I the third in line? Because for me, once I realize where I am, where they are in the buying process and where I am, that's going to change my approach and change the kinds of questions I ask. So that's an important piece of important detail. And we certainly want to know, well, who we're up against, who our competitors are. I have salespeople tell me from time to time, they don't like to ask that question. And the rationale for not asking it is, Mark, they might not even be looking at competitors. They might not even know to look to competitors. And so once I ask them, what kind of due diligence are you doing, or are you evaluating other options? That might alert them to the fact, I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? People aren't living in a cave. It's not this big enlightenment that when you buy something that you can look at other options. Heck, you can press a button in Google and find 5 options like that. So for every one time you think you've alerted someone to other options that they may not have been aware of, they could have done due diligence or shopped, there'll be 10 more times that you've had an advantage because you were able to find out the competitors, you were able to differentiate yourself and your company against those competitors and really establish your value. But the difference here is, if you look at this question, what stage of the buying process are you at? Are you evaluating other options? It's very agenda driven, the way those are phrased. If I'm a prospect and you ask me that, I know why you're asking. I get it. It's part of your job. I don't love it. I don't know if I feel like I want to share those things with you, but I know why you're asking. Whereas if you say, what is your ideal buying experience so this process is seamless? How many of you are asking that kind of question? And look at how it's phrased. What's your ideal buying experience? So now I'm asking the prospect, how can I make this so I don't sound like a salesperson, so it's not every other interaction you've been frustrated by in the past, and then you get people to share their core values and what's important around communication and things like that. And then you can kind of poke around at the buying process and the other options because you've opened the door in a very positive, friendly way. Segues and transitions, it's very important, but it's also important that when you're segueing questions and things like that, you're asking them in a very friendly, approachable way and not a very aggressive, salesy kind of way. Now look, I mentioned about money. One other point I want to make about money is this. As far as asking budget, look, it's got to be asked. In this webinar today, I do a whole training around budget and talking about money, but that's not what today is about. What I will tell you is your job in the buying process is to ask a leading question at some point that allows you to talk about budget without coming right out and saying, what's your budget? Because if you just have to ask the question, so by the way, what's your budget in all this? People don't like to talk about money, and they're unlikely to give you their budget because they have a lot of fears. So it's your job to ask, based on the due diligence, based on the buying process, based on evaluating other options, set the table for that. Okay. Closing questions. Hold on one second. One more slide before we get to closing questions. Decision-making criteria. One big point I want you to take away from this, and this works two ways. Number one, when someone asks you to differentiate your company and you use things like service, responsiveness, good communication and follow-up, product quality, if you give me that kind of fluff, I'm going to look at you and go, I don't know what any of those things mean. Because those things are so ambiguous. It means so many things to so many different people. I don't know what those mean. We get in these habits as salespeople where we use these words, these common everyday words, and we assume when we say service, we assume that our core values and requirements personally around service will be the same as theirs. What is it about your service that makes you stand out? What is it about your responsiveness, your communication, your follow-up, and product quality? What makes your product at such a high-end quality? So what I want you to think about here is when you're sharing those things, they're ambiguous and vague, and don't assume they know what you mean. When they are sharing those things, and they're telling you, when you say to them, one of the most fundamentally must-ask questions, what are your decision-making criteria? And I say, aside from money. Because when you say aside from money, you know most of the time they're always going to say money anyway. And even if they weren't, it shows you care enough that you would understand money's important to them, even if they didn't. So what are your decision-making criteria aside from money? That is a must-ask question. And if they look at you and say, well, service, follow-up, and product quality, your response should be, well, can you explain specifically what you mean on those things? Because if you don't know, you're not understanding what the customer's needs are. So that's decision-making criteria. Closing questions. So I thought a lot about these next couple of slides before I did them, because I've always resented how people describe rapport building and closing as stages in a sales process. It's boggled my mind. Rapport building never stops and closing never stops. I just watched the movie Glengarry Glen Ross again, and I got to tell you, that movie is a crack up. What a cast too. And so, you know, that always be closing reference. You know what the problem is? The problem is that the word closing scares the crap out of people. And so it's the word. It's like sales, it's like change, it's like emotions. Closing goes right with those words. So when you tell someone who struggles to be assertive, which is many, many salespeople, by the way, you need to always be closing, or you need to do a better job closing, they've got head trash around the word closing. That's where it starts. So think about that for a minute. Always be closing implies an aggressive action. So the way I look at it is, I don't look at it as always be closing. I like to always be taking the temperature and understand where I stand. and if what I'm saying is resonating and connecting with the prospect. So you see that first question, does the solution or product feel like the right fit? You don't ask that at the end. You ask that all the way through, because as you're sharing selling points and value adds and what you see as solutions, you don't just answer their concern a question. After you answer it, you'd say, does that sound like what you were looking for? Does that make sense? Is this what you thought you needed? That's what always be closing means. And we've got to put it in simpler terms, because word choice means so much to people, the way people process information and overcome their fears. So that's a big one. Number two, do you have any questions or remaining concerns that would make you hesitate in moving forward? Well, look, to me, and I'm going to go back into a job interview scenario. At the end of a job interview, when everybody's thanking each other for their time, that's always my last question. Do you have any questions or remaining concerns that would make you hesitate to hire me? Do you have any questions or remaining concerns that would make you hesitant in using our service or product? It is your last chance to vet out fears and concerns. Must be asked. Okay. So now we're at something that the last part of the closing aspect, which I want to cover. And let me deal with the first question up top. If you remember, I mentioned a few minutes ago, you really want to know if they're looking at other solutions, are you first, second, or third on the list? And if you've really done a good job educating your prospect and you've developed a nice rapport with them, this is a standard question I will ask. Can I have the first right of refusal once you've evaluated all your options? And it doesn't hurt to ask, right? There's no downside to asking. The worst they say is no. But the best they say is, yeah, I'm grateful. A lot of you have been on my past webinars. Will notice this is called reciprocity. This is one of Robert Cialdini's stages of influence. And a lot of you will notice, and everybody on this webinar today, if you haven't been on a past webinar, you'll get an email like this from me. And the email basically asks you all for reciprocity. I'm assertive about it. I basically say, listen, I'm happy to add value and do free webinars and add to people's time. And in so many words, I say, in return, would you share my post on LinkedIn? Will you send me some feedback? I ask for something in return. Some people respond, some people don't. It's okay if you don't respond. But at the end of the day, this is about assertiveness. And so, yes, I'm going to ask for something in return. And I think when you spend a lot of time with someone and you're educating them on things they didn't know, it's important to ask for that right of refusal. That to me is a high level part of a sales interaction. And if I was listening to one of your recorded calls, I'd be really fired up about that if I heard that. Okay, 5 dates. Most of us at the end of an interaction will say, what are the next steps, action items? A lot of you I know to do that, whatever. You ready for this? You should be asking for 5 dates. Every time I say that, people are like, you're out of your mind. What do you mean 5 dates? Now, again, before I quickly go through these 5 dates, I want to stress, if as I do this, you're going through your mind and you're like, oh my God, that could take a while or whatever. This takes maybe 2 minutes max. 5 dates you need to know. Number 1, if there's other decision makers involved, when will they be sharing the information with other decision makers? 2, the follow-up date that you have with them to review questions and concerns after you've sent them the proposal or whatever you're sending them. And that date, that second date, should be made before the interaction ends. Get out your calendar and say, hey, I have my calendar open. Shall we schedule next Thursday to follow up after you've had a time to look? Make the appointment right then and there. Get it on their calendar. They'll see it on their calendar and they'll know it's a priority when they come into work on Monday and they're like, oh, Thursday, yeah, I got to go talk to those other decision makers. Number 3, this is the crux of everything, all of you. Want versus need. When you ask for the decision date, and how many times in your career have they given you a decision date that has fallen by the wayside and has not happened when they said it was going to happen, that's because your decision date is a want date, not a need date. So I will literally say, so when are you hoping to have this project underway or the decision made? And let's say they say, well, certainly by June 15th, mid-June. And I say, okay, excellent. And if it didn't happen by June 15th, like when do you really need to have it happen? That's the date, not the date you've been currently getting your whole career. It's the need date. Want date, need date. And then the fifth date is the kickoff date. And what the kickoff date is about, and this is a very important nuance of this part of the conversation, is at this point I will share, so let's say they have June 15th as their date. At this point I will say, all right, well, for me to get this project underway, we typically have about a 4-week period it takes for everybody in our organization to get it set up. And how long, and then I'll say, how long will it take you to pull things together once we agree this is the solution? So now let's say they say, yeah, probably about the same 4 weeks. Well, if it's May 13th and they told you they need to get it implemented by June 15th, you got a problem, because that means they'd have to have the decision tomorrow, and they're probably not going to have the decision tomorrow. So here's the point. The point is, by having that interaction of how much time does my company need, how much time does your company need to get this underway, now you've given them a reason why it would have to be done by June 15th and why they would have to have a decision made by the end of next week to pull off the need date of June 15th. And then the final is the implementation start date. So 5 dates, ladies and gentlemen, have to have them. You know, and if you don't get that need date, if you don't get that follow-up date on your calendar, you're missing. All right. So now let's transition to self-assessment a little bit in our final 10 minutes. So we talk about self-assessment. It is very hard to self-assess. I often ask the question to people, when you lay your head on your pillow at night, how do you know you were good at what you were supposed to be good at? Were you a good husband, wife, mother, father, salesperson, leader? How do you really know? It's very hard to self-assess. And frankly, most people, when they self-assess, are inclined to be negative and beat themselves up and be hard on themselves. And this is one of the reasons I talk about goals being so critically important, having SMART goals, because it's too easy to say you're not good or not doing enough if you don't actually have goals where you could measure it either way. So, I have a running joke about, this is going to show my age, but I remember on the SAT in high school, I always used to joke, you get a 400 just for showing up. Well, I'm not a participation trophy guy. And I want you to be able to honestly self-assess what you're doing, but not beat yourself up. I want you to honestly self-assess. So when I work with sales leaders, these are the 6 things that I say, if you go over to one of your team members after they get off a call or have had an interaction, they should be able to answer these 6 questions. If they get off the call and they can't answer these 6 questions, they haven't done their job. These are 6 things that you have got to establish on that call. And look, it's not just why will they buy, why is it urgent? And it's not just why won't they buy, it's how could you overcome? So these are all the things you need. And this is what I call a bare minimum. This is a basic self-assessment that salespeople could use and that sales leaders can use. Now, I promised you I would get to this. You must earn the right. You must ask a question to earn the right to sell something. So let me address this. Too often in sales, we get caught up in our selling points. And we find those selling points to be powerful because we've often made deals because of those specific selling points or value propositions. The problem is, when you blurt out a selling point, it may not have any value to that person. The other competitors that you're up against may have also shared those same selling point, and they're not so impressed that you have it because everybody has it. So the question is, if you are selling and you are leading with your selling points, it's an enormous mistake. So when I say you must ask a question to earn the right to sell something, what I'm specifically saying is, let's say one of my selling points was continuous learning for training, because a lot of companies struggle to really, they'll go to a one-off training and then it won't continue. So I could say, you know, one of the great things about Mindset Go is we have a whole continuous learning plan. I could say that, but number one, it might not impress them. Number two, it might have, the last company they used to do this may have also had a continuous learning plan, and that wasn't what they didn't like. So what I would say is, to earn the right to sell something, I would say, so let's talk about continuous learning a little bit. Where does that fit into your priorities and kind of the problems you're trying to solve? And then if they said, well, yeah, we've been really concerned that, you know, there is no continuous learning aspect, then I can educate and talk about it. But if you lead with it before you clarify and understand what the pain is for the person around that selling point, you lose and you sound like everybody else. So understand what your values and differentiators are, but talk about the ones that really matter and resonate to the prospect, and don't just assume all of them do. All right. So really trying to understand qualifying and tire kickers. We don't want yes, no, maybe. Okay, we just don't. We want people to prove they're serious. And when we're having an interaction, one of the most difficult things can be qualifying. All right. And I just want to preface my comment by saying something. There are level 2 self-assessment things that are really high-end, sophisticated things for a sales call. And I'm not going over them, A, because of time, and B, because I'm going to email them to you as a resource. This is a special resource I've developed for sales leaders on what high-end sales calls and interactions should look like. So I will cover that in my email with you after the fact. So qualifying. Look, one of the things we want to feel like we didn't waste our time, right? That's the worst for salespeople, feeling like you've invested time, feel like you started to believe it could happen and a deal could close and it wouldn't happen. So there's a couple of quick hints I want to cover about qualifying. Number one of the things that I notice about qualifying is if the first question is about money and the theme of the questions always comes back to money. That to me is a tire kicker. That to me is someone that may just be doing due diligence. Now, let's be honest. The simplest way, if you felt like during an interaction you were getting a tire kicker, is just to come right out and ask and be assertive. You could say, hey, you know, just for curiosity, before we go any further, are you just doing some basic due diligence and kind of evaluating options, or you definitely know you're going to choose a company for this product or service? That's the question. Just ask it, because then you're setting expectations, and you know going into the rest of the call that if they are just kind of poking around evaluating, then you know how to handle that call a little bit differently. Not totally differently, but a little differently. So that's an assertive way to do it. What I look at is when I'm trying to qualify people and vet out tire kickers, I'm looking at what their timeline is to solve the problem. I'm looking at what their specific expectations are during this call. I'm looking at their level of dissatisfaction if they have an existing solution, things like that. And you know what else I'm asking? What kind of questions they're asking. Are these very thoughtful, engaging questions, or are they pretty basic questions? So those are some examples of how to qualify tire kickers so you don't end up with maybes and you're getting more yeses and nos. Oops. Okay, last but not least, habits. So I'm hoping we met mutual expectations. I'm hoping that you got at least 2 or 3 takeaways that you can use, whether it's questions, whether it's approaches, communication, and conversation styles from this webinar. To break an old habit, you need to create an old habit. It's changing habits, it's replacing habits. So the bottom line is, here's what it comes down to, right? It's you have to recognize what you did to replace the old habit. And what I want to stress as our final thought today is this. If as you listen to this webinar today, there are things you said to yourself, yeah, I would do that. I would ask that. Or, boy, I used to do that. Boy, this has been a good refresher because I forgot I should be doing some of those things. Whether it's a refresher, whether it's new information, whether it's enhancing something you're already doing, whatever it is, you weren't doing it. So the question is, if you weren't doing it, how do you start doing it? Remember what I said in the beginning about why us, why now? The problem didn't happen yesterday, so you need to know the depth of the problem. If you aren't doing this habit for whatever reason, you don't get off the phone today and just snap your fingers and assume the habit will kick in. It's not really how it works. So what you have to do is you have to understand what's going to cue the habit. So even if there's a specific thing, like let's say, for example, one of the things you want to do is you want to ask about the consequence. Well, what's the consequence if you don't move forward? Let's say that's a question you want to incorporate into your routine. Well, so where are you going to put it to remember in your process of talking to clients and prospects? More importantly, even if you don't remember in the moment, will you remember after the fact? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an example of mindfulness. So if you intend on incorporating a habit, the first stage is recognizing that you're not doing it. The next stage is recognizing the opportunity to do it. So if you have a sales call and you miss that question, the consequence question, even though you know you wanted to and you know it's the right, most effective way to do it, if after the call you say, oh man, I can't believe I forgot, that's great. Because that's the first step, is recognizing that you were supposed to do it and you didn't. But if you really, whatever you wrote down in your notes today, I'm going to send you an abbreviated version of this PowerPoint. Whatever you see that you like and you want to use, it's not magic. You have to find a way to incorporate it into your routine and process. And that is a very difficult thing for people. Okay, lastly, final notes. Number one, assessments. Look, I do a lot of assessments for sales teams as a whole, sales leaders, individuals, and we use those to create a roadmap for virtual coaching or training. These are understanding where your weaknesses lie, where your core competencies still need to be developed. Upcoming events. You will be added to the Mindset Go newsletter, so you will be emailed about upcoming events, so you don't have to stress about remembering to check the events page. But these are the next two webinars we're doing. May 20th on overcoming objections, and May 21st will be one of my trainers, Joe Lyman, talking about thinking clearly, effectively, and critically. But you will be added to the newsletter, and certainly you can keep track that way. As I said a few moments ago, jokingly, I will do a thank you post to all of you and tag you. I would really appreciate if you would share on your network and comment about your experiences. That would be wonderful. This is some information about Mindset Go. We also have a podcast called I Communicate, where we cover leadership, sales, and communication strategies in different situations on a week-to-week basis. And if you do make a referral for coaching, speaking, or training, I do a revenue share, just so you know that as well. And if you want more information on coaching or training, please let us know. Anybody else have any questions before we go? Any questions? Like I said, if you want to talk to me about coaching and training or just have a general question, please reach out, but I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes if anybody has questions. Okay, thank you all very, very much for your time, and I will look forward to talking to you again in the future. Have a great day.